My name is Hydna of Scione, and this is the story of how I learned that the gods watch us all. Even in our darkest moments beneath the wine-dark sea, I should begin where all stories of the sea must begin, with my father, Scyllius, in our small fishing town nestled between the rocky cliffs of the peninsula. Every child grows up knowing the rhythm of the waves, the taste of salt spray, and the way the morning light dances across the harbor. But I was different from the other children, for while they played with toys carved from driftwood, I learned to hold my breath until my lungs burned like fire. And while they feared the depths, I came to love the silence of the underwater world. Father taught me everything he knew about the sea. The ocean is not our enemy, he would say as we prepared for another dive, checking our leather pouches and sharpening our bronze knives. It is a partner in an ancient dance. Respect it, understand it, and it will provide. On the morning that would change everything, I watched Father grip the edge of our small boat with both hands. His weathered face turned skyward. The water held his body steady as he floated, but I could see the fatigue in the way his shoulders rose and fell. His ears rang. I knew, because mine did too after deep dives, and colored circles danced before his eyes like spirits of the sea. The rainbow deceived me, Father muttered, staring at the perfectly still surface of the water. Like all people of the sea, he believed in omens and signs. A rainbow's end points toward the direction from which wind will blow. But this rainbow had lied. Not a single leaf stirred on the plane trees along the shore. The sky held no clouds. Everything had frozen in an ominous stillness that made my skin prickle with unease. Time to go down again, master. Spore's shaggy head appeared over the side of the boat. His protruding ears and thick lips, the kind that mark good-natured people, breaking into a grin. It's almost noon, and our bag still isn't full. You're laughing at me, Father replied, though I could see amusement in his eyes. I've already gone down twice. If you don't go down at least once more, we won't even earn enough for an amphora of wine. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support, Spore. Father's slave was always exaggerating. The sponges Father had gathered today could buy not just an amphora but a whole pithos of wine. Yet we needed more than wine. There was bread to buy, salt, oil, wool, linen, and for those of us who harvest sponges, we couldn't do without sulfur to bleach them white and make them valuable in the markets. How many things a father needs when he has a grown daughter. Once, Spore had also been a diver, making Father's work easier, but disaster struck when some fish, we never knew what kind, grabbed Spore's heel. His leg swelled and turned blue-black. Father had to cut away half his foot to save Spore's life. Now Spore lived, but he could no longer swim or dive. All he could do was sit in the boat, hold the rope, and pull Father up from the depths. Fine, Father grumbled, clearly dissatisfied. Spore quickly threw the rope over the side, its flat stone weight carrying it down, and handed Father his curved knife. Father gripped the knife between his thumb and forefinger of his left hand, still holding onto the boat's edge. Oil, he commanded, pulling himself up. Spore brought an amphora to Father's lips. The familiar bitter taste of olive oil filled his mouth. No diver from Scione would dare descend to the bottom without oil in his mouth. We believed it protected not only the mouth but also the nose and ears during rapid descent to the depths. Now Father could no longer speak. He nodded to Spore, who immediately released the rope. The heavy stone pulled the rope to the bottom, taking Father with it. Before my eyes, the greenish water swirled, and bright schools of fish flashed past. At this spot, it was no deeper than 20 cubits, and within moments, Father's feet touched the bottom. I watched from above as Father spat out the oil and bent to his work. If someone could have seen him through the thickness of the water, they might have thought he was gathering flowers. The sponges, tender, light yellow ones, swayed before his eyes like fantastic fairy tale plants. Father crawled on his knees from one sponge to another, cutting them with quick, precise strikes. Before hiding each sponge in his leather pouch tied to his belt, Father would shake it gently. Small crabs and fish hide in the pores of sponges. If you don't shake them out, they die. Run away, little ones. Father always thought as he shook each sponge, but the air in his lungs was running out. Father jerked the rope, and it immediately began to rise. He grabbed the stone with both hands and untied it, then jerked the rope twice and gripped it with his legs. Rising was harder than descending, perhaps because there wasn't enough air. Finally, Father's head broke through the water surface, and he began breathing quickly and greedily. Spore grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him into the boat with one swift motion. My legs ached terribly. Pain squeezed his head as if a stone pillar was pressing down on it. I should have risen more slowly, Father thought, but then there would have been less time for work. His thoughts became confused, and he dozed off in the warm afternoon Sunday. When Father woke, the boat was swaying, tied up in our small bay. The sun stood at its peak and burned like a potter's furnace. Spore had spread the day's catch on the stones and was counting aloud. 45, 46, 40. What comes after 46? 47, I said, smiling. I knew Spore wasn't much of a counter, and this amused me. Once, when Spore still wasn't lame, he took 80 sponges to sell in Potidaea, but brought back payment for only 18. Fortunately, an honest merchant noticed the error and returned the money on the next market day. Listen, Scyllius, Spore said, settling down beside the boat. How many sponges have you gathered in all these years? I don't know, Father answered absently. It seems to me there are fewer stars in the sky than sponges you and other Scione divers have collected. Where have all these sponges gone? Your Hydna has one sponge. She uses it to dry her hair after washing. 5 or 6 years she's been satisfied with one sponge. Rich men's daughters probably use a sponge once and throw it away, and you dive to the bottom for them. Bah! Spore spat in annoyance and angrily tossed an empty leather bag into the boat. Father laughed, but the laughter turned into a harsh, rasping cough. He bent over, placing both palms on his chest. What a strange fellow you are, Spore, Father said, after catching his breath. Do you think sponges are only needed for drying hair? What do soldiers put under their helmets so they don't chafe and, when necessary, soften the blow of a strike? What do they use in rich houses to clean shoes? To wash bowls and pots? To wipe dust from expensive chests and tables? Everything is done with our sponges. And when someone's heart hurts, they take that same sponge, soak it in undiluted wine, and place it on their chest. Spore's eyes widened in amazement. Well, look at that, he said slowly. So it's healing. And I thought nothing of it. Just seagrass, and that's all. It's not grass at all, but a sea creature, like a sea urchin or starfish, only simpler. It was then that we heard it, ringing voice calling across the water. Father, where are you? Hydna, Spore exclaimed. She's back early today. Wasn't she supposed to buy sulfur too? When I saw Father, my eyes lit up as if a sunbeam had reflected off the greenish water and touched his face. How like her mother Hydna is, Father always thought. The same turn of the head, the same matte skin, the same laugh that makes the heart rejoice. The girl seems a bit clumsy, jerky in her movements. But how well she swims, how she rows. But Father noticed something troubling in my voice. He looked at me anxiously. What's wrong? Hydna, why are you so pale? I shook my head, and my hair fell like a black wave over my tanned shoulders. I'm not pale at all, Father. But in Potidaea, no one is buying sponges. On the road, beyond the city gates, there's a horde of barbarians marching, in long, colorful clothing, with bows and spears, and horsemen, and chariots, and some giant beasts with 2 humps on their backs. They're marching, and you can't see where they end. It's begun, Father cried out, covering his face with his hands. Poor Hellas, what awaits you? That night, I lay on my simple bed in our small house, staring through the window at the stars that seemed closer than usual, as if they too were watching the events unfolding in our world. The Persian army I had seen on the road to Potidaea moved like a river of metal and flesh, unstoppable and vast beyond comprehension. I had grown up hearing stories of distant wars, but they had always seemed like tales from another world. Now, with the Persians so close I could see the dust clouds they raised, war was no longer a story. It was real, and it was coming for us. Sleep evaded me as I listened to the waves lapping against the shore outside our house. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the great King Xerxes was planning to crush our small world of fishing boats and sponge diving. I was young then, perhaps 16 summers, but I understood that everything was about to change. Father had spoken often of the first Persian invasion 10 years earlier, when their ships had been wrecked in storms and their army defeated at Marathon. The gods protected us then, he would say, but will they do so again? As I finally drifted towards sleep, I wondered if I would ever again wake to the peaceful sound of Spore counting sponges, or if the next sounds I heard would be the clash of bronze and the cries of battle. The next morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of Spore's voice raised in distress. Oh no. Oh no. What a disaster. What happened, Spore? Father asked anxiously. Disaster! Disaster! Look what's happening at sea. Nothing but trouble. Father jumped up and, throwing on his chiton, ran to where Spore stood, pointing toward the harbor. What are you yelling about? Tell me clearly what's out there. Ships. So many ships. I started counting on my fingers. I ran out of fingers on my hands and feet. Then I started setting aside small stones, and I built up a whole pile. Without waiting for the end of the story, Father rushed outside. The entire bay, from edge to edge, was filled with ships, penters, triremes, and fast myoparans. The decks swarmed with people. Oars rose and fell, churning the sea's surface into foam. The sails hung motionless. The ships were heading west, toward Potidaea, rounding the peninsula where stood Scione, Mende, and other cities. Oh, Master, Spore wailed, running from the house. They'll tear up the nets. They'll drive away all the fish. Last evening, Spore had lowered his net into the sea near the cape that the ships were now passing. We need to pull up the net, Father thought, or we'll be left without a catch. Now that there's war, bread and oil will be expensive. Spore, Father ordered. Tell Hydna she shouldn't leave the house today. But at that moment, the sound of a horn echoed from somewhere in the distance. Father's heart clenched anxiously. No, now he had to forget about nets. They were calling him to the agora. The agora was a level square surrounded by low buildings near the sea itself. A thick smell of tar and fish always hung over it. Often, the entire space was occupied by nets on high poles, with fishermen crawling around on their hands and knees, methodically removing and hanging the nets to dry with the characteristic unhurried manner of all Scione residents. When assemblies were held on the agora, the speakers usually talked about bait, anchors, tuna, swordfish, sea crabs, and sponges. Scione was a city of fishermen and sponge gatherers, nestled among the cliffs of the rocky peninsula. It lived its own special life, making no claims to glory or power over other cities. On the platform for speakers stood an unfamiliar man with a staff wrapped in green branches. Several dozen men in old felt hats had gathered around him. Father immediately understood that an ambassador had arrived in the city to address the citizens. The ambassador raised his staff above his head and spoke, emphasizing each word. The people of Athens ask you, Scione citizens, to take part in the struggle for the freedom of the Greeks. We have equipped all our triremes against the barbarians. The Corinthians have sent 40 triremes, the Megarians 20, the Chalcidians the same number. The Eretrians have sent 7 triremes. In total, we have 270 triremes. Are you ready to help the fatherland in these terrible days? An uncomfortable silence fell. Father was the first to break it. Scione citizens, he said, How are we worse than others? Our city has one trireme. Let's give it to the Greeks. And I myself am ready to be a rower or sailor if no one younger and stronger than me can be found." The fishermen shifted from foot to foot, lowering their eyes. From the crowd stepped a thin, suntanned man about 45 years old. He slowly climbed onto the platform made of several stone slabs laid one on top of another. This was Creon, a local rich man who had made his fortune reselling fish and sponges. "We all know and respect Scyllius as an excellent swimmer and diver," Creon said. "But underwater, you can't see much. I've had to travel, meet with various people, both Greeks and barbarians. The Athenian ambassador has hidden from you, Scione citizens, that the cities and tribes of neighboring Thessaly have submitted to the Persians, that the Thebans, Argives, and Achaeans have refused to fight against Xerxes. King Xerxes is not fighting against the Greeks, but against Athens and Sparta, who killed his ambassadors." Do you know what the Delphic oracle answered the Athenians last year, when they asked about the future? "What do you wait here for, wretched ones? Flee to the ends of the earth. Leave your homes and the heights of your wheel-shaped city forever. For nothing will remain. Neither head nor body will survive. Hands and feet will perish in smoke and fires. Look, the gods stand, covered in sweat from fear. Blood flows down the roofs of their temples, foretelling evil fate. So go, lifting your spirit above misfortune." Recently, the Athenians again turned to the oracle, and it told them, "Pray to the winds. Don't you understand what it meant? Raise your sails and trust to the wind." Scyllius suggests giving the Greeks our only trireme. The Greeks now have 270 triremes. With ours, there will be 271 triremes, but the Persians have 1,000 ships. The citizens silently nodded their heads. The prophecy of the Delphic oracle had made a great impression on them. If the Athenians had only one hope left, the favor of the winds, then how could they help them? Only Father stood by his position. "Rivers are formed from streams, thick ropes from fibers, a mighty fleet from ships," Father shouted. "Isn't it better to unite our forces while we're all still not slaves?" No one supported Father. The ambassador was given the answer that Scione could not help the people of Athens and other Greeks in any way. The ambassador departed on the road to Mende. The wreath he had thrown lay by the stone slabs, pathetic and unnecessary. The Scione citizens had not listened to Father's appeals. Too great was their fear of the Persian king's might. Father stared gloomily at the houses that seemed ghostly and unreal in the evening sunlight, at the grayish-green sky hanging over roofs and portico columns. Suddenly he was overcome by a feeling as if he were standing at the bottom of the sea, among the ruins of a city hidden under water. A heavy stone lay at his feet. He need only push it away, and Father would soar upward like a bird. Then a new feeling burned through him. Fear. Not for himself, but for me. He had ordered that I not leave the house today. But the Persians who had bypassed Potidea would come to Scione. If not today, then tomorrow. Would the bolts on his little house stop them? Father ran along the path worn in the yellow grass. Dry stalks struck his legs. His broad chest rose and fell heavily, pushing air out with a wheeze. There was our tile roof. Lit by the slanting rays of the sun, it burned as if covered with blood. When I think back to that evening, I remember how the fear began to take root in my heart. Not the sharp, sudden fear that comes with immediate danger, but the deep, gnawing fear that comes with understanding that your world is about to end. I had walked to Potidea many times before, carrying Father's sponges to market. It was a pleasant journey on most days. About an hour's walk through olive groves and past small farms where shepherds tended their flocks. I knew every turn in the path, every landmark along the way. But that morning had been different. I had set out before dawn as usual, carrying our leather satchel filled with the finest sponges from Father's recent dives. The morning mist still clung to the ground, and the air held the crisp coolness that promised a clear day. As I approached the city walls of Potidea, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of a waking city, merchants calling their wares, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, the lowing of cattle, were absent. Instead, There was an odd tension in the air, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. At the city gates, I found the reason. The guards were not at their usual posts, but instead stood atop the walls, staring eastward with expressions of disbelief and fear. When I called up to ask if I could enter to sell my sponges, one of them looked down at me as if seeing a ghost. "Girl," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Haven't you seen them? The Persian army?" "What Persian army?" I asked, though my heart was already beginning to race. "Turn around, child. Look to the east. They've been passing for 3 days now, and still we see no end to them." I turned and climbed a small hill that gave a view over the eastern approach to the city. What I saw there will remain burned in my memory until my dying day. A road, if it could still be called a road, had disappeared beneath a river of humanity that stretched from horizon to horizon. Thousands upon thousands of men marched in columns, their weapons glinting in the morning sun like scales on some monstrous serpent. The sound was indescribable. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that made my bones ache with its alien wrongness. I saw cavalry units with horses that seemed too fine, too proud to be earthly beasts. I saw infantry in armor that caught the light in colors I had never seen before. Not the simple bronze of our Greek warriors, but something that shifted between gold and purple and deep crimson. There were archers with bows as tall as men, spearmen whose weapons seemed to scrape the very clouds, and the creatures Spohr would later describe as giant beasts with 2 humps. I now knew these must be the camels I had heard about in travelers' tales. They moved with an alien grace, their long necks swaying as they carried packs and supplies for this impossible army. But it was not just the size of the force that terrified me. It was the wrongness of it. This army moved with a purpose that felt as inevitable as the tide, as unstoppable as an avalanche. Watching them, I understood with terrible clarity that they had not come to negotiate or to make threats. They had come to erase everything I had ever known. I stood on that hill for what felt like hours, though it was probably only moments. A part of me wanted to run home immediately to warn Father. Another part was frozen by the magnitude of what I was witnessing. How do you tell someone that the end of the world is marching toward them? When I finally tore myself away and returned to the city gates, I found them closed. The guards called down that the markets were canceled, that all citizens should return to their homes and prepare for whatever was coming. The journey back to Scione passed in a blur. Every shadow seemed to hide Persian scouts. Every distant sound might be the approaching army. By the time I reached home, the sun was high, and the peaceful routine of Father's diving seemed like something from a dream. Now, as I lay in my bed listening to Father and Spohr discuss the morning's events, I realized that my trip to Potidaea had marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The child who had set out that morning with a bag of sponges to sell had not returned. In her place was someone who had seen the face of conquest and knew that everything she loved was about to be tested in ways she could barely imagine. The stars outside my window no longer seemed like distant, peaceful lights. They looked like the eyes of gods, watching to see what we mortals would do when faced with the impossible. The next morning brought no peace, only the confirmation of our worst fears. The massive Persian fleet that Father and Spohr had spotted was now clearly visible from our small bay, stretching across the horizon like a dark stain on the wine-dark sea. I sat by the water's edge, picking through smooth pebbles while waves crashed against the shore with a threatening roar that seemed to echo the hidden anxiety and confusion deep in my soul. No matter what I tried to think about, my memory kept returning to the road to Potidaea. Those monstrous figures in colorful clothing emerged from clouds of dust raised by thousands of feet and hooves. The thunder of footsteps, the creaking of wheels, bleating, neighing, shouting, all of it merged into a terrible din that was hostile to the harmony of nature, to its modest, unassuming beauty. How unbearable it was to realize your helplessness before the disaster that was inevitably approaching. The barbarians would come here too. They would pitch their tents on these cliffs that changed color in the sunlight. They would release those hideous, humpbacked beasts into the meadow where I gathered flowers, and with their cloven hooves these monsters would trample everything that was so dear to me. The The sea roared mysteriously and menacingly. It seemed that it too was agitated and offended by something. Or was this just my troubled imagination? The crimson ball of the sun was half hidden in the sea, and had painted the torn and tattered clouds. You see, Spore, Father said solemnly, pointing at the sky. There will be wind. The rainbow didn't deceive me after all. You've thought up something bad, Spore grumbled. Everyone else is staying home. Well, let the Persians come. They won't eat you. And there's nothing to take from us anyway. A leaky boat and a net. Be quiet, Spore. At least leave Hydna behind. The slave continued. You say yourself there will be wind. We'll be carried out to sea or smashed against the rocks. And this is no job for a girl. Shut up, Father commanded. Better bring another knife. Pour water into the amphora and bring some quail. And tell Hydna to get ready. I had been watching this exchange from where I sat among the rocks, and my heart began to pound. Father's plan was becoming clear, though he had not yet spoken it aloud. The fleet of Persian ships riding at anchor in the bay, the coming storm, the knives. I began to understand what he intended. That night, our small boat entered a tiny cove at the foot of Mount Pelion. The bronze-clad prow scraped against the stones of the shore with a metallic ring. Immediately came another sound, the scraping noise of the boat being dragged onto the beach. Quieter, Spore, came a whisper. Quieter. There might be guards here. A silence fell that was broken by no sound. Everything around was black. The sand scattered with boulders. The sky, and the water in the cove. No, these weren't enemy sentries. A fish had jumped. This splash only deepened the silence further. Wait for me here, Father whispered. He disappeared into the black chasms of the cliffs, whose outlines resembled towers and fortress walls. The sound of small stones rolling from under his feet could be heard. Much time passed before a human figure appeared on top of the cliff that hung over the shore. From here, one could see the Persian fleet, or rather its nearest ships. The others disappeared in the darkness. The ships looked like giant sea monsters that had stuck their hideous heads with wide mouths and bared teeth out of the water. The small red dots of stern lights glowed like tiny, malevolent little eyes, watching the shore with hidden hatred. Father turned his head and listened. He seemed to hear what no one else could hear. Every wind has its own special voice. Zephyr's voice is ringing, like a nightingale's. Notice's is hoarse and dry, like that of a traveler dying of thirst in the desert. Eurys's is full and deep. When Eurus blows, the mountains that embrace the bay like a horseshoe seem higher and clearer. Father's stern face lit up. He fell to his knees and raised both hands upward. The Delphic oracle had advised praying to the winds, and Father prayed to the wind, calling it by name, Hellespontius. It comes in clear weather and in silence. It brings the storm. The Scione citizens, frightened by the enemy, had refused to send the Greeks their only ship. But Father had decided to fight the Persian fleet himself. With him were his daughter Hydna, the slave Spore, and Hellespontius. Father came down from the cliff and stopped by the boat that had been pulled onto the shore. Spore handed him a knife. As always, when he went down to the sea bottom for sponges, the diver tied the knife to his belt. "Give me the second one," he commanded. "We'll swim together." I threw off my chiton. All the muscles on my lean body tensed and trembled. I took the knife from Spore, fixed my hair covered with a white cap, and approached the water. The waves splashed quietly. Father and daughter swam side by side. The Black Sea, like tar, didn't frighten them, and Hellespontius, gaining strength, pleased them. Less than a stadion remained to the Persian ships. The lantern burning on the nearest one served as a beacon for the swimmers. Here Father's hands impatiently found the anchor rope of the nearest ship. The diver whispered thanks to the gods, and almost immediately he felt my shoulder. I had swum almost the entire distance from shore to ship underwater and surface next to Father. "Swim to the second rope," Father called to me. He wasn't afraid that they would hear him on the barbarian ship. The sea roared like a herd of enraged bulls. If Father and I had decided to return to the shore where Spore was waiting for us, we would have been smashed against the stones, through the white foam of the waves. Father saw my head appear at the stern where the second anchor rope descended. As they had agreed, I gave him a signal with my hand and immediately set to work. Of course, an anchor rope is not a sponge. You can't cut it with one blow, and the waves toss you around like a piece of wood. Try to hold on. At that moment, Father felt inhuman pain. He understood rather than saw what had happened. I had cut through my rope first, and the stern of the ship, turning, had crashed with terrible force into the neighboring ship. Some piece of debris had fallen on the diver's head. Losing consciousness, Father cried out to me, "Hydna, my hands have no more strength. Death has come for me. But don't wait for dawn. Remember, the gods are watching you." Perhaps Father would have said something more, but another wave thunderously covered him completely. And when it receded, I could no longer see Father. The waves beat against the stones, and in their roar I seemed to hear, "Remember, the gods are watching you." I want to pause here in my telling, for this moment changed everything. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, I went from being a daughter learning her father's trade to being alone in the storm-tossed darkness with only the gods as my witness. The pain of losing Father was like a physical blow, but there was no time to grieve. The storm that Father had prayed for was building in power, and I could feel Hellespontius beginning to show his true strength. The Persian ships around me were already beginning to strain against their remaining anchor lines, and I knew this was only the beginning. Father had been right about the wind. Even now, I could feel it building, sensed the change in the wave's rhythm that meant the real tempest was yet to come. The rainbow had not deceived him after all. It had pointed toward this night, this storm, this chance to strike a blow for freedom. But as I clung to the anchor rope of the Persian ship, fighting to keep my position in the churning water, I realized that Father's death meant more than personal loss. It meant that what had begun as our mission together was now mine alone. The gods who Father said were watching, they were watching me now, a young woman barely past childhood, expecting me to continue what we had started. The Persian fleet stretched out around me in the darkness. Hundreds of ships that had come to destroy everything I loved. Father had managed to damage 2 of them before the sea claimed him. How many more could one person sabotage before exhaustion, or the storm, or the enemy claimed her too? I didn't know the answer to that question. But as I drew my knife and began to work on the next anchor rope, I knew I was going to find out. The gods were watching, Father had said. Very well then, let them watch and judge whether a fisherman's daughter from Scione had the courage to face impossible odds. The wind was rising, and I had work to do. Darkness, not a single star in the sky, but I felt no fear, no fatigue, no cold. I knew that through this gloom, the gods were watching me. Father had said so. The first glimmer of light broke through the clouds, and 2 thin pink streaks appeared in the darkness. Divine lines from Homer flashed through my memory. Dawn appeared. Rosy-fingered Eos. Dawn. Little star. I seemed to feel my mother's touch, though I had never known her. No, I was not alone in this world. I had lost Father, but the gods were watching me, and Hellas awaited my deed. Under the water it was calm. In the murky green twilight, a school of fish flashed by. On the bottom, sponges swayed quietly. Pink and yellow ones. All his life, Father had cut them with his knife like a harvester cuts grain with his sickle. Father had never been a warrior, and had never held a sword in his hands. He would still be alive now, if not for these ships. From below, they looked like giant, ominous monsters, frozen in threatening stillness, ready to spring. The anchor ropes stretched taut, like the strings of a lyre. But a few strokes of the knife, and the ship lurches to one side. Now it's held by only one anchor. A few more strokes, and it will be thrown onto the rocks. Now I need to surface and get some air. And again underwater, the Persian sailors couldn't understand for a long time what was happening to their ships. The anchors and ropes were reliable, and the storm shouldn't have been able to tear them away. Why then did one ship after another break free from their moorings and become helpless toys of the waves? Terror seized the Persians, running out from the holds. They raised their hands to the sky covered with thick clouds. The Magi decided that only blood sacrifices could calm the raging sea. They brought prisoners onto the decks, cut off their heads, and threw them into the sea. But the sea didn't accept the sacrifices. More and more ships broke from their anchors, and like lead shot from a sling, flew whistling onto the rocks. They split like nuts, crashing into each other, tangling in their rigging, turning into piles of wreckage. The sea raged in its insatiable fury, as if taking revenge on the King of Kings for the humiliation it had suffered at the Hellespont. Xerxes had beaten the sea with whips, like a disobedient slave. Now it rose in waves. It tore ropes and anchors, as if wanting to show its power. Xerxes huddled like a snail under his purple tent and cursed himself for getting involved with this uncontrollable element. All the tribes and peoples of Asia obeyed him. Their kings bowed their heads, even those willful Greeks, except for the Spartans and Athenians, had given him earth and water. His army was advancing to Thermopylae. Tomorrow it would be in Boeotia, the day after tomorrow in Athens, and in 2 more days it should capture Sparta. But the sea had sided with the rebels and madmen. Its azure gleam was a mask. It was treacherous and deceitful. And not only Xerxes found it incomprehensible what was happening near Mount Pelion. Greek scouts hiding in the bushes also watched the strange destruction of Persian ships with amazement. They didn't believe their eyes. A torch soaked in tar flared up on the mountaintop. To the Allied fleet at Artemisium flew the fiery news of the storm and the destruction of 24 enemy ships. The Navarchs at Artemisium made sacrifices to Poseidon, whom they began to call the savior from that time on. But I knew the truth of what was happening, and that knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. Each time I surfaced for air between sabotage missions, I could see the chaos spreading through the Persian fleet. Ships that had been secure were now wallowing helplessly as the storm grew stronger. Some had already been driven onto the rocky shores, their hulls splitting like ripe fruit. The water was getting rougher with each dive. What had started as manageable swells were becoming mountains of foam and fury. Hellespontius was living up to his reputation as a bringer of storms, and I could feel his power building with each passing hour. My body was beginning to show the strain. My arms ached from fighting the current. My lungs burned from the repeated deep dives, and my hands were raw from gripping the rough anchor ropes. But every time I felt myself weakening, I thought of Father's last words. The gods are watching you. Swimming between the Persian ships in the pre-dawn darkness, I began to understand the true scale of what we had set in motion. This wasn't just about cutting a few anchor ropes. We had given Hellespontius the opportunity he needed to unleash his full fury on the Persian fleet. Each ship I freed from its moorings became a weapon against the others, crashing into neighboring vessels and spreading the chaos further. I remember diving beneath one particularly large ship, what the Persians called the Galley of the Gods, because of its size and ornate decorations. As I worked on its massive anchor rope, I could hear the sounds filtering down through the water. Shouts of alarm, the crash of loose cargo rolling across the deck, the splintering of wood as the ship began to move unpredictably. When I finally cut through that rope, the ship's sudden movement sent a shock wave through the water that I could feel in my bones. Above me, I knew chaos was erupting as this massive vessel, no longer held in place, began to move with the storm's power. Surfacing between 2 smaller ships, I gasped for air and looked around at what we had accomplished. The orderly formation of the Persian fleet was dissolving into pandemonium. Ships that had been arranged in neat rows were now scattered like leaves in a gale, some already running aground on the shores of Mount Pelion, others tangled together in heaps of broken masts and torn sails. The storm was reaching its full intensity now. Waves as tall as houses crashed over the decks of even the largest ships, and the wind howled like all the furies of Hades had been released at once. I realized that I was witnessing something beyond mere military sabotage. This was the sea itself rising up in rebellion against the Persian invasion. But I also knew that my part in this divine drama was far from over. There were still dozens of ships riding at anchor, still hundreds more that might weather this storm if they remained secured to their moorings. and I was growing tired, my strength ebbing with each dive. As I prepared to swim toward the next cluster of ships, a terrifying thought occurred to me. What if I didn't have the strength to make it back to shore? What if, like Father, I was destined to become another sacrifice to the cause of Greek freedom? The thought should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a strange kind of peace. If the gods had chosen this role for me, then I would play it to the very end. Better to die in service to something greater than myself than to live as a slave under Persian rule. I took a deep breath, dove beneath the churning surface, and swam toward the next ship. The gods were watching, and I would not disappoint them. The storm did not abate for 3 days, destroying enemy ships. Only on the 4th day did the Persian magi, through prayers and blood sacrifices, calm it. Or perhaps, as the Greek historian Herodotus believed, it subsided by itself, having exhausted all its fury. In that terrible year of the Persian invasion, devastated and torn, Hellas had not yet seen such a bright morning. The air was motionless, reflecting the blue dome of the sky. The sea slumbered peacefully. Gentle waves ran onto the sand strewn with wreckage, and reminded one of a blue carpet that barely swayed. For 3 days and nights, I had continued Father's work, alone. Each dive became harder than the last. Each cut of the knife required more effort. But I could not stop. The gods were watching. I felt their eyes upon me even in the darkest depths. By the 2nd night, my body was failing me. The cold had seeped into my bones, and my muscles cramped with exhaustion. More than once, I nearly didn't make it back to the surface in time, but each time I felt myself weakening. I would think of the Persian army I had seen marching toward Potidæa, of the homes that would be burned, the families that would be enslaved, the children who would grow up knowing only Persian masters. On the 3rd day, as the storm reached its peak fury, I managed one final dive. My hands could barely grip the knife anymore, and my vision was blurring from exhaustion and lack of air. But there was one more anchor rope, a massive cable holding what looked like the flagship of this part of the fleet. The ship above me was enormous, its hull painted with gold and scarlet decorations that gleamed even in the filtered light underwater. This was clearly a vessel of importance, perhaps carrying one of Xerxes' admirals or a contingent of his elite immortals. If I could free this ship, let the storm drive it into the others. I began to saw at the thick rope, my movements growing weaker with each stroke. The fiber was tough, designed to hold even in the worst weather. My knife seemed barely to scratch it. Above me, I could hear the sounds of panic, as the crew realized their ship was beginning to move despite being anchored. The air in my lungs was running out. I had to surface, but I was so close to cutting through the rope completely. Just a few more strokes. My vision started to go dark around the edges. My body was demanding that I breathe, but I forced myself to make one more cut, then another. The rope parted with a sudden snap that I felt more than heard. The ship above me lurched violently as the storm caught it, and I was tumbled through the water like a leaf in a whirlwind. Fighting desperately toward the surface, I finally broke through into the howling wind and driving rain. What I saw around me was like something from the tales of the Titans' war against the gods. The Persian fleet was no longer a fleet at all, but a collection of broken, scattered vessels being driven toward the rocks by Hellespontius's fury. Ships crashed into each other with sounds like thunder, their masts snapping like twigs, their proud decorations torn away by wind and wave. The flagship I had just freed was already careening toward a cluster of smaller vessels, its massive bulk unstoppable in the storm's grip. When it struck them, the sound was like the world breaking apart. Wood splintered, men screamed, and the sea swallowed everything in its green darkness. I tried to swim back toward shore, but I could no longer tell which direction the shore lay. Everything was chaos. Wind, rain, the crash of waves, the screams of drowning men. My exhausted body could barely keep me afloat, let alone make progress against the storm. That's when I felt the change in the water around me. The sea itself seemed to be moving, carrying me in a direction I couldn't control. For a moment, I panicked, thinking I was being swept out to the open ocean, but then I realized this was different. This wasn't the random violence of the storm. This felt purposeful, as if the sea itself was guiding me. I stopped fighting and let the current carry me. Through the howling wind and driving spray, I began to make out the dark bulk of the shoreline. The sea was bringing me home, delivering me back to the rocky coast of Mount Pelion where this all began. When I finally felt rocks beneath my feet, I was so exhausted I could barely stand. I crawled up onto a small strip of beach, my body shaking with cold and fatigue. Behind me, the Persian fleet continued to destroy itself in the storm's fury. Ahead of me lay the uncertain path back to whatever remained of my old life. As I lay there gasping on the wet stones, I thought about Father. We had done it. Together. Even after death separated us, we had struck a blow against the Persian invasion that would echo through history. But the victory felt hollow without him there to share it. The gods had been watching, just as Father had said. They had seen a fisherman's daughter choose duty over safety, courage over fear. They had seen her dive again and again into the storm-tossed waters, cutting the anchor ropes that held the enemy fleet secure. And when her strength finally gave out, they had guided her safely home. But I knew this was not the end of my story. Somewhere across the storm-lashed waters, the main Persian fleet was still intact, still moving toward its inevitable confrontation with the combined Greek forces. The battle at Artemisium was still to come, and the outcome of that fight might well depend on what we had accomplished here. In the darkness and fury of Hellespontius' storm, I closed my eyes and listened to the wind howling around me. In its voice, I could almost hear Father speaking. The gods are watching you, Hydna. They are watching, and they remember. The storm was beginning to ease, but I knew the real test of our sacrifice was yet to come. When I think back to those 3 days alone in the storm, they seem like something from another life, or perhaps a dream sent by the gods to test my resolve. But the ache in my muscles and the salt burns on my skin reminded me that every moment had been terrifyingly real. On the morning after Father's death, I faced a choice that would define not just my own fate, but perhaps the fate of Greece itself. I could have swum back to shore, found Spore waiting anxiously by our beached boat, and returned to the safety of our home in Scione. No one would have blamed me. I had already done more than anyone could expect of a fisherman's daughter. But as I clung to the anchor rope of the Persian ship and watched the storm building in power, I knew I could not abandon what Father and I had started. The memory of the endless Persian army I had seen marching toward Potidaea burned in my mind. Those weren't just soldiers. They were harbingers of a world where Greek children would grow up speaking Persian, where our gods would be forgotten, where the very idea of freedom would become just a story old men whispered in secret. So I chose to stay, to continue diving and cutting until either the Persian fleet was crippled or the sea claimed me as it had claimed Father. The second day was the hardest. My body, pushed beyond its limits, began to rebel against what I was asking it to do. Every dive felt like diving into molten bronze. Every cut of the knife sent fire, shooting through my cramped fingers. The storm was reaching its full fury now, and even underwater I could feel its power pulling at me, threatening to dash me against the ship's hulls or drag me down to where the drowned sailors of yesterday's sabotage vessels lay in eternal darkness. It was during one of these dives that I nearly joined them. I was working on the anchor rope of what looked like a Persian supply ship, its belly heavy with grain and oil meant to feed the invasion army. The rope was thicker than usual, and my exhausted arms could barely grip the knife properly. I was so focused on cutting through the stubborn fibers that I lost track of how long I had been underwater. When my body finally screamed for air, I looked up and realized with horror that I couldn't see the surface. Somehow, in my exhaustion, I had become disoriented. Above me was only darkness, and I no longer knew which way was up. Panic seized me then, as it never had before. I began to swim desperately in what I hoped was the right direction. But my lungs were already burning, and my vision was starting to blur. This was how I would die. Not in glorious battle, but lost and confused in the depths. Another victim of my own exhaustion. But then something extraordinary happened. I felt a presence in the water beside me. Not threatening, but guiding. It was as if invisible hands were gently turning me, pointing me toward the surface I could no longer find. Following this guidance, I swam upward and broke through into the storm-lashed air just as my lungs were about to give out entirely. I never saw what saved me that day, but I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't chance. The gods Father had spoken of weren't just watching, they were protecting me, ensuring I could complete the task they had set before me. That knowledge gave me strength to continue even when my body was screaming for rest. By the third day, I had moved beyond ordinary exhaustion into something else entirely. My movements became automatic. Mechanical. Dive. Swim to the next ship. Find the anchor rope. Cut. Surface. Repeat. I was no longer fully conscious in any normal sense, but rather moving in a kind of divine trance where my will merged with the will of the gods themselves. The Persian fleet around me was in complete chaos now. Ships that had been proudly anchored in knee formations were scattered across miles of churning sea. Some had been driven onto the rocks and were breaking apart in the surf. Others had collided with their neighbors and were sinking in tangled masses of rope and timber. The storm had become our ally, but it was an ally I had purchased with 3 days and nights of pain that I pray no other mortal will ever have to endure. It was late on the third afternoon when I made my final dive. I had been working steadily along a line of smaller vessels, fast scouts and message ships, that the Persian admirals used to coordinate their massive fleet. These were the ships that would carry orders from the flagship to the various contingents. The nervous system of the Persian naval force. The last ship in this line was different from the others. Smaller, faster, but clearly important. Its hull was decorated with golden dolphins, and its prow was carved in the shape of a sea serpent's head. This had to be the personal vessel of someone high in the Persian command structure. As I worked on its anchor rope, I could hear sounds from above that were different from the panic and confusion I had grown used to. These were the sounds of organization, officers shouting orders, men moving with purpose rather than fear. Someone on this ship was trying to restore order to the chaos, trying to rally what remained of their fleet. I could not allow that to happen. With the last of my strength, I saw it through the anchor rope. As the ship broke free and began to be carried away by the storm, I heard a voice from above, speaking in accented but clear Greek, crying out commands to other ships. The voice was strong, authoritative, and I knew that in cutting this ship loose, I had probably condemned one of Xerxes' most capable naval commanders to the mercy of Hellespontius. That final effort took everything I had left. When I tried to swim toward the surface, my arms wouldn't respond properly. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The darkness at the edges of my vision wasn't just from lack of air. It was from complete physical collapse. I began to sink, and for a moment, I accepted it. I had done what Father and I set out to do. The Persian fleet was scattered, their careful plans ruined by 3 days of storm and sabotage. If the gods chose to claim me now as the price of victory, I would pay it gladly. But once again, I felt that guiding presence in the water around me. Gentle currents carried me upward when my own efforts failed. I broke the surface one final time, gasping desperately for air, and found myself being carried by the storm surge toward the rocky shore of Mount Pelion. I don't remember reaching land. The next thing I knew, I was lying on wet stones while someone's rough hands turned me onto my side so I could cough up the seawater I had swallowed. Through blurred vision, I saw Spore's worried face looking down at me, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Thought I'd lost you too," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Thought the sea had taken both of you." I tried to speak, to tell him what we had accomplished, but no words would come. I was too exhausted, too damaged by 3 days of impossible effort. All I could do was lie there and listen to the sound of the Persian fleet destroying itself in the fury of Hellespontius. The gods had been watching, just as Father said they would. They had seen a young woman choose to stand alone against impossible odds. They had seen her dive again and again into waters that should have killed her, cutting the ropes that held the enemy secure. And when she had given everything she had to give, they had carried her safely home. But as I lay there on the rocky shore, listening to the sounds of destruction echoing across the water, I knew that this was more than just one person's victory. This was the moment when the tide began to turn, when the seemingly unstoppable Persian invasion began to falter. The gods had chosen an ordinary fisherman's daughter to be their instrument, and through her, they had struck a blow that would echo through history. The storm was ending, but the legend of Hydna of Scione was just beginning. The storm subsided on the fourth day, leaving behind a transformed world, where once the Persian fleet had stood in proud formation. Now only scattered wreckage dotted the coastline. The water had turned from wine dark to a muddy brown, churned up by 3 days of unprecedented fury and choked with the debris of hundreds of ships. But I was too broken to appreciate our victory. Spore carried me back to Scione like a father carries a wounded child, stopping frequently to let me rest when the coughing fits became too severe. My body, pushed far beyond human limits, was failing in ways I didn't yet understand. 15, 13, Spore muttered as he walked, and I realized he was trying to count something. 5, 7, 12. He would get confused and start over. 3, 5, 7, 12. He was counting something. But what? Later I would learn that he was attempting to count the ships we had destroyed, the lives we had saved, the future we had bought with our sacrifice. But numbers had never been Spore's strength, and the magnitude of what had happened was beyond his ability to calculate. When we reached our small house, I collapsed onto my simple bed and didn't rise again for many days. The fever came first, a burning heat that seemed to consume me from within. Then came the coughing that brought up seawater mixed with blood, evidence of the damage the salt water and exhaustion had done to my lungs. My hands, raw and torn from 3 days of gripping rough anchor ropes and bronze knives, became infected, despite Spore's attempts to tend them. But worse than the physical pain was the realization of what I had lost. Father was gone, claimed by the very sea that had been our livelihood and our life. The familiar routine of our days, the morning dives for sponges, the quiet evenings mending nets, the peaceful rhythm of a life lived in harmony with wind and wave, all of that was finished forever. Yet even as I grieved, I could hear the sounds that told me our sacrifice had not been in vain. From my bed, I could hear the horns calling the men of Scione to assembly, could hear the excited voices discussing the miraculous destruction of the Persian fleet. Messengers arrived daily with news from other cities. The great storm had struck all along the coast, destroying not just the ships we had personally sabotaged, but hundreds of others as well. The Persian invasion, which had seemed unstoppable just days before, was now in chaos. Xerxes had lost perhaps a third of his fleet before the real fighting had even begun. The careful coordination between his land and sea forces was disrupted, and the Greek defenders at Thermopylae and Artemisium would face odds that, while still daunting, were no longer impossible. One evening, as my fever finally began to break, a visitor came to our small house. I heard Spore talking in hushed tones with someone at our door, and then footsteps approached my bedside. Hydna of Scione. I opened my eyes to see a man I didn't recognize. Clearly Greek, but not from our small fishing town. He was dressed in the simple tunic of a traveler, but something in his bearing suggested authority. "I am Theron of Athens," he said, settling onto a stool beside my bed. "I bring word from the fleet at Artemisium." My throat was too raw to speak easily, but I managed to whisper, "What word?" "Thanks," he said simply. "The Navarchs wish you to know that your sacrifice has given us hope. The Persian fleet that we face tomorrow will be smaller, less confident, because of what you and your father accomplished." He paused, studying my face carefully. "They also wish you to know that statues will be raised in your honor at Delphi, at the sacred center of our world. Your name will be remembered as long as Greeks love freedom." I tried to respond, but a coughing fit seized me. When it passed, Theron was still there, waiting patiently. "There's something else," he said gently. "The battle at Artemisium begins tomorrow. We go to face what remains of Xerxes' fleet, and we do so knowing that the gods have already shown their favor through you. Win or lose, the Persian king now knows that even the humblest Greek, even a fisherman's daughter, will fight to the death, rather than accept slavery. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of waves against our shore, the same waves that had carried me through 3 days of impossible diving, that had guided me to safety when my strength failed, that had swept away the anchors and hopes of the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. I thought about Father's last words. The gods are watching you. He had been right. They had watched as I chose duty over safety, courage over comfort, freedom over life itself. They had watched, and they had judged me worthy of their protection, but they had also watched as I paid the price for that protection. My body would never fully recover from those 3 days in the storm. The infections in my lungs would return again and again, each time leaving me weaker. The damage to my hands meant I would never again be able to dive for sponges, as Father had taught me. The life I had known was ending, sacrificed on the altar of Greek freedom. Was it worth it? As I lay there listening to the sea, I thought of the Persian army I had seen marching toward Potidaea. Endless, implacable, seemingly unstoppable. I thought of what our world would look like under Persian rule. Our gods forgotten, our language banned, our children raised as slaves. I thought of all the other young women across Greece who would never have to make the choice I had made because we had made it for them. Yes, it was worth it. 1,000 times worth it. Outside my window, a gentle wind was blowing from the west. Not Hellespontius with his storms and fury, but Zephyrus with his promise of peace and renewal. Tomorrow, the Greek fleet would face the Persians at Artemisium. In a few days or weeks, King Leonidas would make his stand at Thermopylae. The great battles that would decide the fate of our civilization were still to come. But tonight, as I drifted towards sleep for the first time in days without fever, I knew that Father and I had played our part. We had shown the world and the gods that even the smallest acts of courage could change the course of history. The gods had been watching, just as Father promised, and they would remember that years have passed since that terrible storm, and I am no longer the young woman who dove into the tempest to cut anchor ropes in the darkness. The infections in my lungs returned, as I feared they would, each bout leaving me weaker than the last. My hands, once sure and steady in the water, now tremble when I try to hold a cup of wine. The sea that gave me life also claimed it. Payment for the 3 days when I dared to fight alongside the gods themselves. But I lived long enough to see the fruits of our sacrifice. And that knowledge has sustained me through the pain and weakness of these final years. The battle at Artemisium, when it came, was not the decisive victory the Greeks had hoped for. The numbers were still too heavily in Xerxes' favor, despite the ships we had destroyed. But it was not the crushing defeat it might have been either. The Persian fleet, disorganized and demoralized by the losses they had suffered in the storm, fought without their previous confidence. The Greek triremes, inspired by tales of the mysterious saboteur who had wrought such havoc in the storm, fought with desperate courage. Theron returned to Scione after the battle to tell me what had happened. The Greek fleet had been forced to withdraw, but they had bloodied the Persians badly enough to prove that the seemingly invincible Persian navy could be beaten. More importantly, the delay caused by the storm had given the Greeks precious time to prepare their defenses. Your father would have been proud, Theron told me as we sat by the harbor where Father had once taught me to dive. The Navarchs speak of the storm of Hydna as the moment when the tide began to turn. I learned later that Themistocles himself, the architect of the Greek naval strategy, had used our story to inspire his crews. If a fisherman's daughter can fight the entire Persian fleet alone, he told them, what can free Greeks accomplish when they fight together? The answer to that question came at Salamis, where the Greek fleet finally destroyed Persian naval power forever, and at Plataea, where the Persian army was crushed and driven from Greek soil. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable was stopped. The empire that had seemed eternal was revealed to be merely mortal. But the most enduring monument to what Father and I accomplished was not a military victory, but something far more precious to me personally. True to Theron's word, statues of Father and me were erected at Delphi, at the sacred center of the Greek world. I never saw them myself. My ruined health made the journey impossible, but travelers brought me descriptions of them. Father was shown as he had been in life. Strong, determined, a man of the sea. But the statue of me was different from anything that had been carved before. Instead of depicting a goddess or an idealized beauty, the sculptor had created something new. A young woman in mid-dive, her body stretched toward the water, every muscle tense with effort and determination. My hair was plastered against my skull, my clothing molded to my body by the water, capturing the moment of transition between the world of air and the world beneath the waves. It doesn't look like the other statues, one visitor told me. It looks real, like someone caught in the middle of doing something important. That was exactly what I had hoped for. Not a monument to beauty or divine perfection, but a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the cause was just and the gods were watching. The statues stood in Delphi for nearly 500 years, becoming one of the most visited monuments in all of Greece. Pilgrims would come from across the Mediterranean world to see the fisherman's daughter who had fought the Persian fleet alone. Poets wrote verses about the storm of Hydna. Painters decorated vases with scenes of a young woman diving beneath enemy ships while lightning split the sky above. But all earthly monuments eventually fall, and ours were no exception. A Roman emperor, one of those who fancied himself a patron of the arts, decided he wanted the statues for his palace in Rome. By then, Greece was just a province in the Roman Empire, and there was no one left with the power to refuse him. The ships carrying the statues never reached Rome. A storm, witnesses said it came out of nowhere, just like the one that destroyed the Persian fleet, wrecked the vessels off the coast of Crete. The statues sank into the same waters where Father and I had learned to dive as children. Old fishermen still tell stories about that storm. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the water is clear, you can see lights moving beneath the waves near where the statues went down. They say it's the spirit of Hydna, still diving, still fighting for freedom even in death. I don't know if those stories are true, but I like to think they are. As I write these words, I can feel my time drawing to a close. The old lung infection has returned, and this time I don't think I have the strength to fight it off, but I'm not afraid. Death has been a familiar companion since that night when Father fell beneath the waves. I've lived these extra years as a gift from the gods. Time to see that our sacrifice was not in vain. The Persian Empire, which seemed so mighty and eternal when I was young, has crumbled. Alexander of Macedon conquered it utterly, spreading Greek culture from Egypt to India. The freedom we fought for has grown beyond anything we could have imagined. But the most important legacy of our storm is not political or military. It's the knowledge that no enemy, no matter how powerful, is invincible if free people are willing to stand against them. It's the understanding that the gods don't always choose kings and heroes as their instruments. Sometimes they choose fishermen's daughters who happen to be in the right place at the right time with the courage to do what must be done. I have told this story as I remember it, as truthfully as failing memory and long years allow. Future generations will probably change it, add to it, make it more heroic or more tragic, as suits their needs. That's the way of stories. They become what people need them to become. But whatever changes they make, I hope they remember this. We were not special people. Father was a simple sponge diver. I was his daughter who had learned to swim. We had no divine parentage, no magic weapons, no special destiny written in the stars. We were ordinary people who found ourselves facing an extraordinary moment, and we chose to do our duty rather than seek safety. That choice is available to everyone, in every generation, when the crucial moment comes. The gods are always watching, waiting to see what we will choose when the test arrives. I pray that when your test comes, you will choose as we did. The sun is setting now over the harbor of Scione, painting the water the same wine-dark color it had on the night Father and I swam out to meet the Persian fleet. Spore is preparing my evening meal, though I doubt I'll be able to eat much. My body is failing, but my spirit is at peace. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, new storms are gathering. There will always be new enemies, new threats to freedom, new moments when ordinary people must choose between safety and duty. But I have faith in the generations that will come after us. They will make the right choice. as we did, because the gods are watching, and because the sea remembers everything.